We are so excited. I talked about being on the forefront of research, and we are so privileged to have Dr. Esperanza Miyake, whom I'll invite on screen at the moment, to also share her slides with us. Dr. Miyake is a Chancellor's Fellow and Senior Lecturer in Journalism, Media and Communications, and also the Chair of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion in the Department of Humanities at the University of Strathclyde. She's got a very impressive bio that I'll let you read in the link shared by Naomi in the chat for everybody, and take this last minute to tell you how much I've really enjoyed her book published last year, Virtual Influencers, Digital Identity in the Age of Multiple Realities. Now, as scholars, we all love reading and we all love a good book, but I must say this book in particular covers such an expansive scope of a forefront and innovative phenomena that you cannot help but wonder just how quickly Miyake works, or just how deep she has sunk her teeth and her roots into studying this phenomenon. The book covers topics like virtual place and nationhood, virtual emotions and intimacy, immaterialities of everyday life, but even biopolitics, necropolitics, mimetic visualities. And it's really so cross-cutting across many fields and disciplines that there is something there for everyone, even if you work outside of the humanities. Without further ado, can I please invite Dr. Miyake to come online, share his screen, and also share her slides with us. Over to you, Dr. Miyake.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Let me just seamlessly share my screen. Is that showing?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Crystal. And thank you for today for inviting me. It's really amazing to be with you all. And the program looks fantastic. I'm sorry I can't stay because I have to go to work. It's really early in the morning here. I will just quickly dive in. I just wanted to give you some context because today Krista and Rachel suggested I do an overview of my book. So I just wanted to give you a bit of context. So as the title suggests, I explore virtual and AI influencers and how they impact digital culture, society, and economy. And I was particularly interested in the way they worked across different realities. So not just virtual reality, but reality, AR, mixed reality. And I looked at over 40 virtual influencers over various platforms across various contexts, US, Japan, Brazil, and so on. And I conducted thematic and textual analysis, looked at basically their accounts from where their profile started right up to 2023. And as you can imagine, the landscape really, really changed as I was moving through the research. By the end of I finished the book, it was very different. So these are some of the key themes that I want to explore today, and I appreciate this is very specific. This program today is about Asia Pacific. I want to say some of this is beyond that, but hopefully I'm going to touch on concepts that I don't know, maybe can be thought of in different contexts, and it will help with some discussion. So first of all, I just wanted to think about the genealogy of virtual influencers, because there was a lot of sort of at some point towards the end of 2010, media was going crazy saying, oh, virtual influencers are popping up everywhere. But as we all know today, they're kind of, maybe the word virtual influencers might be relatively recent, but this idea of virtual figures have been there for a while. So I wanted to think about what it is in terms of not just the academic research, but the forces that came together to create and let this virtual influencer in its current form emerge. And so I started thinking about three different forces identified and so one is existing discourses around the sort of philosophical, ontological inquiry about who we are and how the virtual other, not necessarily digital, but there's always been a discourse around questioning this other that we've created and what it means for us, the self, another, and what it is to be human. And as you can see, that matches the sort of academic discourse around it, philosophy, human-computer interaction. They seek these sorts of questions, and that's the way virtual influences are starting to be understood in some areas. Another second area, I'm trying to move really quickly here because I have a lot to cover. Apologies if I'm speaking really quickly, is in the area of marketing PR, which has always had, you know, this idea of before even social media, this idea of influencers and influencing and persuasive language, as well as in terms of producing and consuming virtuality. As we know, you know, that sort of virtual idols and things like that have existed for a while. So what I guess this second force is this idea of profiteering and the industry of influencing and commodification virtuality. So it's seen as a sort of, yeah, economic political tool. And then the third category is obviously the technology. We need the technology there for virtual inferences to be created. So we've always been fascinated into seeking other realities and how we can express different identities in other realities. So again, the discourse, the academic discourse matches that sort of phenomenon. So there's these three forces came together, and that's basically the first chapter looks at the genealogy and how virtual inferences are, we've come to this point. I have to move really quickly. So one of the things that fascinated me about virtual influences when I was looking, there was this general sense of so here we see India's first virtual influencer, or South Africa's virtual influencer, Japan's. There was a lot of this kind of claiming, nations were claiming that virtual influencers, almost like brand, not just brand ambassadors, but as national sort of ambassadors of culture. So I started to think about why this is the case, and the concept here that I looked into is this idea of liquid reality. So I borrow this term from Bauman's sort of liquid modernity, but this idea that our realities, because of the different sort of, we exist in metaverse, on reality filters, augmented, you know, all that there's a sense of convergence as well as fragmentation. And in doing so, there's a sense of disorientation in terms of identity, you know, because our identities are simultaneously fragmenting and converging. That we need to perhaps re-demarcate senses of identity, which includes nationalized sense of identity. So for me, what I saw with this rush of virtual influencers claiming where they're from nationally, well, when I say virtual influencers, the creators of virtual influencers, there's a sense of a global neo-colonial contest to territorialize this new virtual frontier, or new, virtual sort of AI populated kind of frontier. And I saw it's in some ways a geopolitical kind of demarcation of differentiation based on nationhood. I'm not going to go into it deeply because of time, but I looked at this through the lens of Ima, and the way Ima is a Japanese virtual influencer, and how her images visually territorialize this kind of virtual influencer sphere. But also I just wanted to also think about the way virtual influencers, in particular Ima, fashioned virtuality according to national aesthetics. So I just very quickly say Japan loves to play with dimensions. That's why there's 2.5D theaters and things. So a lot of her visual content plays with dimensionality, therefore branding a certain kind of Japanese style of virtuality. So that's the way I was thinking about the nationalization of virtuality, as something mixing aesthetics and national symbols. Another chapter I started looking into was this idea of emotionality. So I noticed, as you know, I'm sure from your research, a lot of virtual influencers, especially the established ones, have these complicated sort of storylines and lots of emotional, like here is Michaela, there's very emotional, quote, relatable content of crying and lots of, sort of this idea of human emotions being felt by virtual influencers. But what was fascinating was, for me, the way the comments, the way people were responding to this was equally effective and equally emotional. And so for me, I started to wonder why this was. And in some ways, it's the pandemic, post-pandemic, there was a real sense of people being used to idea of being connected to virtuality. So not in terms of parasociality, not even the simulation of relationships, as Horton Wall said, but actually the simulation becomes a relationship in Baudrillard's way of simulacrum. So for me, sorry, I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to whiz past through this. But for me, I started to think about this kind of emotionality and the sense of intracommunicative emotionality. So this idea, this simulation, being the relationship, is partly due to not the fact that it's intracommunicative, because it's both representational and presentational. Slightly different to Marshall's idea of that kind of interaction, in the sense that virtual influencers are just representational. There's no life beyond. There's not the real life version of virtual influencer. They are representational, but they're also rely on presentational tools. So in that way, that's why I started thinking of it as intracommunicative. But basically, it's that kind of relying on that is the way affect is built, and the sense of emotionality is built with the audiences and the fans. And I just wanted to quickly put in here as well, I contextualize this within the wider scope of social media capitalism, and how virtual influencers themselves are scripted in a way as a result of extensive research sentiment analysis conducted by those who create virtual influencers. So in some ways, they pick up on emotional trends that are online, which are then fed back to us. So for me, this kind of intercommunicative emotionality is not just an emotional kind of connection between the virtual influencer and the fans at a sort of level of effect, but it's also a level of economics, so effective economics of online social media. I need to whiz past through. Sorry that I keep going very fast. So another thing that I started to think about, again, with this idea of the real and not real and how this connects, is the very materiality of virtual influences. So here I was looking at Ludo Magalu, who's a Brazilian virtual influencer who started off almost like a chat box service, customer service interface for equivalent of sort of Amazon, that sort of thing in Brazil. And she basically sells, so she presents everyday life scenes. But as you can see from this code, you basically, those are the codes, almost like you click on those codes and it will take you to the items that you can see. So I was really fascinated by this and thinking about how that's similar to what human influencers do in terms of selling products through everyday life scenes, but it's slightly different in the sense that they don't have an everyday life. So I was thinking about this through this idea of born virtual and virtualized, which are borrowed from sort of information management archive kind of language, about objects that are born are sort of real life objects that are then virtualized and therefore exist in the virtual world, versus virtually born those things like Ludo Magalu herself is virtually native, interacting with virtualized products. And this led me also, I was thinking in terms of how this is inserted in everyday life. So I was thinking about temporality. So in terms of real human influencers, as I said, their time space, their what appears on online content are slices, time space slices of their everyday life, which constructs a sense of self, the serialization of the self. But in virtual influencers' case, it's actually they serialize the self through the production of everyday life. So they need to make everyday life in order to serialize themselves. So it's the kind of serialization of time, the temporality that realizes them, and it's done through these virtualized products that appear in their born virtual everyday life. So I this part of this chapter, and also I invite you all as well. I'm sure you've been thinking about this yourselves, but this very idea of everyday life and virtual influences, I wanted to challenge, or actually just think about different ways of very everyday life as well in itself, that it's very Euro-American global North ways of thinking about everyday life has been the banal, and somehow we're aestheticizing the boring, human influences elevate what's boring and make it beautiful, which is the way we're thinking. But one thing I was thinking about through Ludo Magalu was in the case of Brazil, that everyday life means something else. It's sort of, kind of about this idea of the violence and all that was part of the everyday life discourse. So within that, something like Ludo Magalu represents a different kind of reality. So I just wanted to throw that out, that I think it's also important to rethink what we mean by everyday, and that it's regionalized, and it means it's highly, we need to think about that in terms of theory and how we think about the banal in everyday life. This second half of my book is quite more critical and sinister in some ways. One of the things I started to notice was actually just the way virtual humans are created. And this goes back to sort of virtual influences as well, how they're created. There's a lot of sort of, and for me, I was looking at this through specifically through the lens of race and raciality. So there was some sort of controversy, for example, around Black influencers, virtual influencers being created by white teens, things like that. So for me, this bothered me. And so that's why I looked into virtual human creation. And what bothered me was this casual way that skin, like black, red, I'm just reading it out there, black, red, yellow, and white, to speed up the process of creating different ethnicities. You can switch. And in some ways, this is just artistic, creativity in the name of hyper realism, high fidelity. We want sort of realistic looking skin colors, but the language was so much hark back to sort of colorism and the Lucian chromatic scale, basically classification of people according to skin color. There's so much biological essentialistic sort of discourse around it. And what bothered me the most was that this is, I guess I said, because of high fidelity, it's based on actual biodata existing from humans. So this isn't just beyond the visual sort of sort of ideological issues around race and representation, but it's actually an issue about classification of datafied bodies. So this is what Lisa Nakamura sort of ages 2009 called social algorithms. But this is just deeply disturbing. We're sort of, in some ways, the creation of virtual influences reflects that kind of exchange of racialized biocapital. It's deeply disturbing for me. So this is something I really wanted to look at. So it's almost verges on sort of surveillance / capitalism, social media capitalism, but we don't realize because virtual influencers are pretty and they sell things, and they obfuscate these kind of these kind of things that are going on, even the stuff that I said earlier on about a sentiment analysis. They're created from our data. That bothers me. I'm going to take a quick sip. So related to all this and moving, sort of still taking a critical, maybe sinister, or I don't know, depressed tone, is I was looking at this also in relation to pandemic and Uncanny Valley. So one of the things I noticed, which was fascinating for me, was during the pandemic, loads of virtual influencers were shown wearing masks. And what was interesting for me was, on the one hand, there was all this market of trying to create virtual influencers who were realistic. And in the comments, if, I don't know, something, the CGI or didn't quite look human, people were quick to point out, oh, look, the hair doesn't look right. So people were hypercritical online about the realism of virtual influencers. But on the other hand, when virtual influencers were ill or showing actual human kind of bodily functions, people were super disturbed. So this is Emma falling ill, and people were sort of having a go at her, saying, why are you ill? You shouldn't be ill. I mean, there were lots of sympathetic comments, but people getting upset that she was ill. That's Bermuda, who had a one-night stand, obviously referring to sex. Some were like, go girl kind of thing, but some were like, you can't have sex. Michaela, or I just picked Michaela, but there's a lot of other influencers who eat. And basically people would say, why you can't eat? Why are you eating? So there was this criticism towards sort of realistic biology. So there is a sense of unbiology that virtual influencers aren't supposed to age. They're supposed to remain pretty forever. They're not supposed to reproduce. They're not supposed to eat and digest. They're not supposed to be diseased or have sex or anything like that. So this made me think a beautiful piece by Black, who talks about unclean biology in terms of cuteness and cute technologies. It's sort of, we're talking about the Barbies thing. We're not allowed to show these kind of non-cute biologies. And this turns into fear. I realize I'm running out of time, so I'll be very quick. So this fear for me really manifested quite strongly during the pandemic towards virtual influencers. There was, for some virtual influencers, a slight hostility towards them, the sort of mask wearing and things. So for me, what I saw was a combination of three forces coming to effect: the uncanny valley effect, which is the kind of the feelings of discomfort towards sort of othered technologies. Pandemic, sort of the way spatiality and spatial proximity shifted during the pandemic because of actual lockdown. And this came together with racialized fears towards the other, which turned sort of xenophobic attacks, this idea of dangerous other, which has always existed towards virtual influences. As we know, a lot of it, virtual influences arise from Asia Pacific, East Asia. So there is that kind of fear towards technology, towards East Asia. And so for me, that really heightened during the pandemic. I'm running out of time, so very quickly say, so this for me it's a kind of, specifically in the context of pandemic, it was a necropolitics of virtuality, how virtuality can be weaponized in terms of what's clean biology, unclean biology, and who's othered within this context. I'm so running out of time, so I'll be very quick. I'll speed through two more chapters. I looked at virtual mimesis and transmedia mobility. So one of the things that I wanted to think about, going back to time, was how virtual influencers, their content, showed different selves. So one of them was media, through media. So lots of pictures of old media, so Polaroids, photo booths, to borrow sort of this idea to create to historicize themselves through historicized technologies. Another was idea of imitation there. The other ones of use of different screens to represent the self. So a lot of photoshopping, virtual influencers showing how they were photoshopping themselves, sort of a dramaturgical expression of the sort of self being created. Again, the construction of the self through imitation of existing technologies, where the medium becomes a self. So I'm sorry, I'm really rushing. And the reason why I'm rushing is that I wanted to come to this bit. So in some situations, I then thought, well, actually, virtual influencers aren't really copying themselves, but in some ways, that is the style. The whole point of the virtual influencer is that they are born virtual, as I mentioned earlier, and they exist across different platforms. That's their appeal. So here earlier on, we have Rosie, who is kind of, that's they start off, she starts off in her Instagram, and then it zooms into the metaverse. So that's an example of their transmedia mobility. They can move across not just platforms, but through different sort of media and different stylizations of themselves. Here we have Emma, who's, you can see the images of herself taken from her Instagram account, which now exist in Animal Crossing. So there's different selves here, which are no longer about imitating the original or splitting, you know, they're not mimetic, they're just different stylizations that are to do with almost like a marketing strategy. And this is where I was thinking about Japanese media studies, where this idea of kara and character, meaning there's the self that exists within the diegetic fictional world. So Instagram, for example, here is then taken outside to widen the audience as Kiara, so existing here as in the Nintendo Animal Crossing world, thereby kind of reaching more audiences. I'm sorry, so this is the last, I promise this is the last chapter. So this moved into the sense of political economy of virtual inferences, thinking about marketing. So one of the things I just was thinking, again, in terms of being critical about this, what bothered me was the way who is making money out of virtual influences, because things like Michaela, that image show her as a working influencer, like a human influencer, but she's not actually making money, even though she's presented as being, you know, working for her income. So I'm gonna rush through this because I'm over time, but I guess one thing I wanted to think about was that virtual inferences, and I was in danger of anthropomorphizing them, that I always forgot that there's actually people behind this, and there's issues around, for example, copyright and ownership, and who's the responsibility of producing these images. And the case of, for example, FM Mecca, for example, here, I mentioned earlier that they sort of somebody, the Black influencer who was created by, I think it was an Asian, I know, anyway, basically, but their image was borrowed by an actual rapper who then sued them. And this raises questions of just the legalities of creating virtual influencers. Okay, I'm just going to stop there because I'm running well over time. So I'm just going to end with some final thoughts. So for me, virtual influencers are both an extractivist technology. So this is what's really important for me, is that they are pretty human beings who sell and make profit, but there's something there which is deeper than that, which is almost at a biological level. It's our data that's been produced, that's been extracted in order to create these virtual humans who then sell things back to us, reflecting us. So it's almost like a cannibalization of us. And they're also transmedia representation. So they, as we move into further into sort of worlds of AI, this will become, I think, even more relevant, but how they operate, not just within social media, but they're going to operate through multiple platforms, through multiple sectors. And as we start thinking more and more towards AI influencers, I think the things we will need to pay more attention to, as just in the previous slide that gets explained very in depth, but it is that kind of ethical side. So we need to think further about data governance and things like participation. Who's participating, creating AI influencers? Because it's not just going to be a team, a small team of, I don't know, whatever, have 10 designers, or, you know, it's going to be collective ways in which we produce AI influencers, right? And things like relationships as well. We've heard of cases of people falling in love with chatbots and things like that. So it's there's various things we need to think about, and I don't want to necessarily end in a word caution, but I'm terrified but fascinated at what lies ahead. And I'm sorry I've gone over a lot. I will stop talking.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miyake. I'll let you catch your breath in a few minutes. For those of us without context, it is about 7-ish, 8 a.m. Where Dr. Miyake lives, and she also has a very big day ahead running events. I hope it's okay. I'm going to use my co-host prerogative to ask the one question that I want to know more about, having read your book and also listened to your presentation. We are sorry you can't join us through the rest of the event, but we're very grateful to have had a bit of your time first thing in the morning.
Thank you so much.
For those of us who are here, please join us in thanking Dr. Miyake. In the link to the program, you will also find a link to her latest book. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce to us our practitioner keynote, Charmaine Poh. As she comes on screen and starts to share her slides, I'll introduce her.